I'd like to introduce our Vice President of Programs, Cindy Neighbor, and she will introduce our guest.
Thank you, and good morning to all of you. Our last couple of meetings has consisted of a panel that has answered questions. Well, I thought today most of the people in this room, I would say all, understand the three branches of government, but oftentimes you see people go out on the street and they'll do interviews and they'll say, what comprises the three branches of government? Sometimes you get the look of, I don't know. Sometimes you get, well, there's a president and there's a Congress, and then some people have no idea what you're talking about at all. I'm sure that all of you know what the three branches of government are, and so we're going to have a conversation between two people that I know and have known for a very long time. Alyssa Rooker is currently a representative of the 25th District. She at one time worked with Clint Eastwood, Dirty Harry. Anybody that can work with Dirty Harry can take on our Kansas government. Let me tell you. She has been a strong stalwart of our education program, and they don't like her on the education committee because she knows too much and asks too many questions. That's how you get eliminated from a committee. When you care, you ask too many questions, and you're too knowledgeable. The other guest speaker that we have today is Tim Owens, and I served with Tim in the House. Tim has served in many different positions. He currently is an adjunct professor at Johnson County Community College, and he teaches just what we're talking about today. He is a lawyer. He's a former representative. He's worked in administration, and he can give you a little bit about his background. And I know you're excited to hear them speak today and not me. So I'm not going to be asking questions because these two have actually talked to each other. And they have a plan. And so we're going to follow that plan. So without further ado, I will turn this over to, which is the first one? Tim is the first one. And I must apologize. He was going to give you a lesson on the screen today on how government looked. I didn't bring the projector. So you have to imagine, and I know you all can imagine what's happening. So without further ado, Mr. Tim Owens.
I hope this works. Well, as Cindy indicated, she started off by letting you know that one of my biggest shortcomings is I'm an IT immigrant. That means I didn't grow up with this language, and so I couldn't make the system work either. So instead of having a PowerPoint presentation that's a lot prettier up here, you're going to have to kind of visualize it. I thought about having everybody just close your eyes and listen, and then it would probably be better. But instead, and I'm going to say this, and I'll probably get in trouble for saying it, but instead of what you thought you were going to have, you're going to have the newest version of Beauty and the Beast today. We got together and discussed how we were going to approach this discussion of the separation of powers and breakdown of government. And as Cindy indicated, I teach state and local government out at the community college and have for about 10 years.
Closer to your mouth.
I guess they said we have to swallow this thing. So. Well, anyway, I teach out at the community college and I teach state and local government. And the way I always start my classes, even though we have some of the best and brightest students that come out of some of the best high schools in the country, it's amazing how little they know about government, even the structure of government. So to begin our discussion today, I thought it'd be important for us to talk about that structure. And what I want you to envision is this. I have a PowerPoint that is a pyramid. And that pyramid is what I call the pyramid of government. It's a three-sided pyramid, and it's got 4 levels. So visualize, if you will, and you folks are very much a part of this first part. The base of the pyramid is the people. The base of the pyramid has always been the people in this country, all the way from the Mayflower Compact when the people decided they were going to be governed. It's the people at the base. And what do the people do to get the rest of the government going? They vote. At least we hope they do. And that's one of our biggest challenges. So I want you to keep that in mind. The base of our government is the people. The next level of that government, if you'll just move up the pyramid with me, is local government. Local government has all of the same sides as the other parts of government do. But it is the government that is the closest to the people. I spent 24 years on the city council here in Overland Park, and my wife, Donna, who's here today, followed me with 8 years on the council. So we are very familiar with local government. And if you think about it, who do you know? You know the people that are representing you at City Hall. You see them in the grocery store, you see them at the movies, you see them in the community. You pick up the phone and you call and you can ask them by their first name, what are you doing? What were you thinking? When you pass that. You can do that because you know them. Okay, the next level of government is the state. Now there's a little thing that I want to tell you about that most people don't know. Does anybody know what Dillon's rule is? Dillon was a judge up in Wisconsin a number of years back, and he made a ruling that said local government serves at the pleasure of the state. Now think about that. Local government serves at the pleasure of the state. The state could do away with all local government. There's nothing in the Constitution about local government. So if you think about that, no state in their right mind is going to want to run every city and county in their state. But that was Dillon's rule. So if you think about that, the state can do all kinds of things to control local government. I think you're going to hear a little bit about that from Melissa in a minute. But anyway, so think about that. The state controls everything below it. Above the state, you have the federal government. And keep in mind, this is a pyramid that keeps getting smaller and smaller as you go up to the top. Now, the reason it does that, in my vision, is because it gets further and further from the people. And yet, if you think about the voting, where do people turn out to vote the most? Vote for the president, whether you know who it is or not. A lot of times people vote because there's an R or a D after their name. But it gets smaller and smaller and further away from the people. The people that can control your daily lives more than anything are the people that are lower down on the pyramid and closer to the people. So keep that in mind. Now, having built that pyramid, I told you there are 3 sides to that pyramid. Those 3 sides are what we're going to talk about today and give you an idea about what each one of those branches is. They are co-equal branches, in spite of what you may have heard from some people lately. Now, the first branch is the legislative branch. Article 1 of the Constitution sets up the legislative branch. And having said that, we're going to move into the first discussion of the first branch, and I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Representative Rooker.
Thank you, Tim. It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity. The setup was great. When I was a kid, there was a video that described the work of the legislative branch. It was part of a cartoon series called Schoolhouse Rock, and that shows the ideal how we make laws in this country. The federal government and the state government, the legislative branches are set up in the same fashion. So we have, in the state capitol, you have a Senate You have a House, just like we do in Washington, D.C. We have 40 state senators. We have 125 state representatives. So I represent, all of us in the House represent roughly 22,000 constituents. And some districts, I think, are 75 to 80,000 today. And every 10 years, based on the census count, we have to draw reapportionment maps to balance population across the districts. In the House, we stand for election every 2 years, and in the Senate, they stand every 4 years, everybody. And so 2016 is a pivotal year for the state because every one of us, all 165 members of your state legislature, stand for re-election. There is real opportunity to affect change in the direction the state is going, but we need to turn out the vote. So it gets back to the power of the people. That is what this democracy is designed to run on. We have a representative democracy. The people elect us to go to Topeka and make decisions on your behalf. Our job is to stay tuned to the constituents that we represent and try and do the best job we can in discerning what the right course of action should be. Some of us take that job very seriously, and some of us don't. Some of us like to listen to outside powers, and that speaks to the money in politics, the influence that money can have. I have colleagues that never do this, never come and speak in front of the folks back home, never make themselves available to listen, never ask questions. And so Cindy alluded to the fact that I asked a lot of questions during my time on the Education Committee and was removed from that. Let me explain the importance of that committee process and why those questions created trouble. So the ideal is that legislation the bill drafts get introduced. The structure of the House is that we have a speaker. The speaker appoints committee chairs. The committee, and there are vice chairs as well. The speaker is in control of who runs the committees. That sets the agenda. The committee chairs entertain bill introductions. Anyone can introduce a bill in the legislature. There's been a lot of press recently about the lack of transparency in that process. Kansas is an outlier in this country in that we allow bills to be introduced without any authorship. That you can introduce a bill anonymously. And so, and there are some pros and cons. We'll get to the minutia in a little while. But so a bill gets introduced into the committee. At the pleasure of the chair, the bill either is heard or not heard. If there's a hearing, that's that time when the public is invited to weigh in. Experts in whatever field is being affected by the contents of that bill are invited to weigh in. In a perfect world, we have laws that will dictate that you have to have proper public notice of such hearings. But in fact, the way we're operating these days is hearings come up spur of the moment. I've had stories of committee hearings getting posted 30 minutes in advance by a paper tacked on the bulletin board in the State House hallway. So it negates your ability to decide, hey, that's a bill that I really want to come and provide some testimony or submit some written testimony. But in the perfect process, the interested parties, both for and against the legislation, or even those that are neutral but just have an opinion about some element of the legislation, provide testimony. You submit it in writing, always, and you can choose to come and speak to the committee. So that's a hearing. The committee can ask questions of the conferees that come and testify, but no action is taken typically on the day of a hearing. The committee chair has, after the hearing stage, the committee chair can decide to work a bill, and that's a work session where the committee can amend and change and do things to work on the bill and choose whether or not to pass it out of committee. It then resides in a place we call below the line, and there is a journal of the House published every day, And that there is a physical line in the journal. Bills above the line are the day's business that we will handle on the floor of the House. Bills below the line are available at the pleasure of the Speaker to be heard at a later date. So we do, basically we follow Mason's rules in the House. We follow Robert's rules in committee work. So in the House, we resolve ourselves into the committee of the whole, and all 125 of us get a chance to debate bills. In theory, we get a chance to amend bills, and that's when we have the opportunity to vote to pass a law or not. In the meantime, the same process is happening on the Senate side, and we get to the midpoint in session. Any legislation that has passed out of one chamber at turnaround is transferred to the other side. So House bills go to the Senate, Senate bills come to the House, and the second half of the session is spent repeating the process. But on our side, the House is now in committee working on Senate bills and vice versa. And when a bill has passed both chambers, a conference committee is appointed if there are differences. So if one side or the other has amended a bill and made it a little different than what they received, it has to go to conference to resolve those differences. That's the process as it should be. What actually happens is very different. So you get these anonymous bill introductions, and this session I had a committee that had a hearing on a bill, and nobody came to testify in favor of the bill, and yet we still had a hearing. So everyone there testifying was against it. Nothing happened. Obviously, we didn't pass the bill out of committee, but what a waste of our time and your taxpayer dollars. Bills can be gutted. The contents of the bill can be stripped out by amendment and replaced with something entirely different. The bill number, the title of the bill, and any people who actually have put their name on it as sponsors don't change, but the contents do. And that's part of the reason why people are sometimes reluctant to put their name on a bill, because the risk exists that you could be very much pro something and the bill could become exactly the opposite. So people are leery, but there ought to be in the record somewhere, it should be a requirement that the minutes reflect who introduced the bill in committee. It's not always the author of the bill, but there ought to be some way to trace the pedigree of the legislation. This year, what we were seeing happen in the House in particular was that we were not being given bills on the House floor that were amendable. And that happens when a Senate bill comes over to us and it comes out of conference committee as a Senate bill. We on the House side have never had a chance to work a House version. And so most of the major policy that passed this year came to the House in a form that did not allow for a full-throated debate and the amendment process and that healthy negotiation that happens through the true system. So the system is being used against us. The rules are in place to protect things, but they're being used to manipulate the process. And a lot was made this year about force the veto, force the governor's hand. On the House side, we actually didn't have that opportunity to actually go ahead and attempt to pass that and put something on his desk because of the way we were hamstrung. So I need you to remember that there are a lot of us there attempting to do the right thing. And in the House, it takes a simple majority to pass a bill. That's 63 of the 125. We got to 58 to 60 votes repeatedly. The school block grant bill passed. Originally, it had the minimum 63 required. One person changed to a yes after the fact, so it had 64 votes. Your tax policy, your budget policy, your election law changes, those all passed with just the bare minimum. So we are that close to regaining some power to negotiate with our House leadership if this election cycle we can get those 5 or so extra seats. So turnout is key. Turnout for the candidates that you care about, who are doing the right thing, and turnout for those candidates that are challenging those who don't. And this organization does a tremendous job of helping identify. So there's a lot more detail, but I'm going to, I think, pass back to Tim. But first, let me toss it to him by saying a couple of the bills that the House has passed and the governor has signed into law have impacted the ability of our courts to function, and I think that's probably where you want to go.
Well, actually, I'm gonna keep us in the order of the Constitution.
Okay, sorry.
But I did want to add just a couple of comments. I did have the opportunity when I was in the Senate to chair the Senate Judiciary Committee, so I learned what it was like and the power that a chair of a committee actually has. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about the judiciary, because that was part of what got me in trouble with the governor. But the chair has a lot of power as to when those bills are going to be heard and what bills are going to be heard and who's going to make the presentation. I had probably more bills in the Judiciary Committee in the Senate than any other committee, including appropriations. And I had 1 hour a day to hear those bills. Now, the hearing and the working of the bills, I had not a hard, fast rule, but most of the time I would not work a bill on the same day we heard it. Because otherwise it looks pretty much to everybody like, oh, you had your mind made up, why'd you bother to hear it? So what I did was I worked 3 bills a day, 5 days a week, much to the chagrin of some of my colleagues who wanted to go home on Friday. But we worked it, and we heard those bills 5 days a week, 3 bills a day in an hour. Now you can imagine when you've got a lot of people who want to talk about a bill, and they come in and make the presentation at the hearing, that's not a lot of time, so you have to really do time management, and that's a chair's responsibility to try to get that done. The other thing I wanted to comment, Melissa, is it okay if I say Melissa instead of Representative? She pointed out that there's a conference committee when there's a disagreement between the 2 houses. That conference committee is made up most of the time by the chair, the vice chair, and the ranking member. Do y'all know what a ranking member is? That's the person appointed by the minority party to be the head of that committee for their party. Those 3 from each house make up the conference committee. And so you get into a horse trading kind of situation, sitting across the table sometimes like this, sometimes across the room, but deciding on how you're going to work the bill in that capacity, and then send it back to both houses for them to consider the amendments that you make. So that's it's the process. But there are so many bills and so many things to take care of that it isn't real easy. And if you haven't ever been over there and watched this process, it can be a little frustrating. It's frustrating when you first get there and trying to get things done because it doesn't work as smoothly sometimes as you want. Anyway, I just wanted to add those comments about the legislative process. The second article of the Constitution deals with the executive branch. I thought maybe Melissa and I could talk a little bit about the executive branch as we know it today, which is probably what you want to hear about. That's, my first thought was, that I should probably start off by saying to arms, the brownbacks are coming. And for those of you that are Republicans, well, I hope you're a Republican like I'm a Republican, like Melissa's a Republican, because the brownbacks are not the Republicans that we know. They are really not. If you want to see a rhino, talk to the brownbacks, because that's who they are. They're really libertarians, and that's what's going on in our government today. And with all of the controls that we talked about, and jump in here, with all the controls that are going on and the efforts to control every branch, That's what's going on in the executive branch. Now, the executive branch, as you know, is headed up by the governor. And the governor appoints all kinds of folks at their discretion, and they can change them. They have committees, you know, social services committees, administration committees, all these departments, Department of Corrections. Those are all under that umbrella of the governor.
Yeah, and so what you see is the idea is to point the best and brightest, and that has happened in our state's history. But a lot of times these appointments are used as political payback, and you get people put in positions of real power that know nothing about the agency they've been appointed to run, and then begin staffing that agency with people who don't know the first thing about the work the agency is supposed to carry out. And so the governor holds that power. The governor is in a key role when it comes to the appointment of the judges in our system. The legislature delivered the power for our governor to appoint judges at the appellate court level a year ago, and we've seen the result of that in his first couple of appointments. It's a very unhealthy direction for the separation of powers in the state. Agencies are being mismanaged, and it's going to take a very long time to right the ship of state after this administration leaves because of the many levels at which these folks are working to dismantle state government, because that is really the goal. Yesterday, when the revenue numbers were released, if any of you've heard me speak in other forums, I constantly try and educate audiences. People always ask, when are we going to fix the problem? Why can't they see what the problem is? How do we educate some of your colleagues about the problem? And I reframe it. We are surrounded by people, we are being led by people who don't view this as a problem. They view it as an opportunity. It's an opportunity to shrink government and dismantle government services. Yesterday, that word was used by the chair of the Senate Ways and Means Committee in the statement he released about the revenue numbers. The estimates for the state for the next 6 months have been radically altered because we are going to be, between now and the end of fiscal year 2017, I think it's $359 million short of where our budget is today. And we are running out of the resources to cover that up with. So he called this an opportunity to re-examine how we conduct business at the government. So that's a whole different mindset than trying to be good stewards. That's something else entirely.
It's kind of interesting when you're involved in the process. I served 3 years under the Hayden administration as the general counsel for SRS, Social and Rehabilitation Services, which is now Children and Family Services. And so I spent 3 years inside the executive branch, and I was eventually fired by Joan Finney when she got elected. But I didn't take it personal because they fired everybody who was appointed by Hayden and hired all these other folks to come in. Now, that can be good, can be bad. Depends on who you appoint. Because you need to have good quality people, no matter what party they're in, who know something about what's going on. And that doesn't always happen. We have people that get appointed, like Melissa said, that they get appointed because it's a political payback. You know, they like to do something, so they've contributed a lot of money, or they've contributed a lot of time to the seated governor, and so, you know, to the victor go the spoils. Now, I can tell you, knowing the people who work in the bureaucracy of the executive branch, people that are there all the time, their career, kind of interesting. I heard some mindsets when I was there. I changed some things in the legal department in SRS when I got there. It was scattered all over the place, and you know, I just thought we needed to pull them together and start functioning as a law firm to represent SRS instead of everybody representing the pieces And sometimes, I went to court one day, and there was a representative from SRS at one table, and a representative from SRS at the other table. That didn't work very well. So, but I talked to the folks who were there all the time. And they said, you know, you can change what you want while you're here. But you'll be gone. And we'll still be here. And we'll go back to the way we were. Now that's a bad mindset by some people. It's not the mindset of the majority of people that work for our government. And we are not overstaffed in most cases. People are stretched about as thin as you can get. Now, again, this is probably politically incorrect, but I'm going to tell you what my grandfather used to say. He was a railroad engineer, had a fourth grade education, but he worked very hard, and he had these little grandfatherisms that he'd come out with. I'd say, Grandpa, how thin is that? He'd say, well, it's about as thin as a gnat's ass stretched over a reindeer. So I remember that when I think about some of these things. That's about where our departments are with the funding issues that Melissa talked about.
Absolutely. I have a committee assignment that was new this year. It's the Transportation and Public Safety Budget Committee. So we hear from all of the agencies that fall under that umbrella. That's our Department of Corrections, the certainly KDOT, Highway Patrol. It's all kinds of different agencies that all relate to public safety. And every single one of them, and a colleague of mine, Nancy Lusk, is here in the audience. Nancy's on a different budget committee for social services, right? I'm willing to bet your experience was the same. Every single agency that came through talked about the need, and particularly the need just in terms of the most basic staffing. Corrections is around 40% of their positions are vacant because our state employees we're going on 9 years since they last could offer a raise to state employees. And our salary structure in most of these agencies is not commensurate with the industry standard in the region around us. And so particularly in areas like Kansas City and other border populations in the state, when you can go right across the state line and work on the Missouri Highway Patrol instead of Kansas Highway Patrol, or go work for a different division of law enforcement with your training, or work in another prison system, without having to pick up and move, you're going to do it because you're getting at least, what the studies that we saw, it's at least 10% more in other jurisdictions than what we're paying today. That's significant. So we don't have an applicant pool, let alone a high-quality applicant pool to draw upon. We are stretched thin across the board. And
on that issue, you might address what is one of the areas that certainly the extremists are constantly wanting to build up?
The corrections, absolutely. You saw it this week. In the corrections, the interim committee, this was the topic, the staffing in our corrections department. It is reaching a crisis point. Our prisons are full. So the idea was discussed in this committee hearing and then reiterated on a KCUR interview the next day by the chair of our House Corrections Committee said, well, we need to take money out of education and put it into the corrections budget so they can offer raises.
Now, when you add to that the fact that they pay, I think, about $13 an hour for the people in corrections, how would you like to be in the kind of position and the kind of job dealing with the people that they're dealing with in corrections at $13 an hour, with the stresses and pressures they have and the 40% reduced in the staffing that you have?
There's been investigative journalism at its finest, exposing the mandatory overtime that within our mental health system and the correction system, the employees they do have are forced to work double shifts and these overtime hours that are inhumane. And we have had a couple of incidents in the mental hospital system that are being investigated that I personally believe could have been prevented if we had adequate resources being provided. And we're talking about death. that has occurred because I think that the overload on the system. So it's a problem.
I don't know how many of you have ever been to any of our state hospitals. If you haven't, you ought to take a tour and go and see. And it's amazing. When I took over as general counsel at SRS, I hit the road and I went around to see all the facilities we were responsible for. And at that time, the state hospitals were under SRS. And I went and I saw the folks that were being cared for. And it gave me a great deal of respect for the people who were the caregivers in those facilities and those operations, because it is an amazing task. And those of you who have relatives and people that you know who need that kind of help, you understand what I'm talking about. And so now what we're facing again in that whole arena is a reduction in the cost and a reduction in the pay for those people that are doing the kind of jobs that they're doing is minimal. So that's what's happening across the board in the executive branch in our state. And it is all because of this fiscal issue, this financial issue. Shrink government. Shrink the amount of money that we have to pay. And shrink the jobs because we don't need them. Well, they haven't been there. And I can tell you that, we have people that have no clue. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the judicial branch in a minute. We have people that believe that the judicial branch is just another agency. They really don't get it, that it's a third co-equal branch. So when you look at how they face this, they look at it totally in the money. It's all about the money. And the people that are fighting so hard to close these things down and believe that there's a lot of waste in government haven't been there. They haven't
Or
gotten
don't
out and
care.
seen it. And that's true. They don't care.
I think some of them don't care. They don't believe that government has a role to play in some of the areas that we actually do need the structure and the capacity that government can bring to the table. I've lived this. I grew up in this area, but for 18 years, my husband and I lived and worked in Los Angeles. And we lived through the Northridge earthquake. It was a natural disaster of epic proportions. And with the LA basin knocked off the grid at 4:30 in the morning on a moonless night, it was cataclysmic. And buildings, as the sun rose, I watched an apartment building collapse behind our house. So the first response was a governmental response. National Guard and all the first responders rescuing people, securing the city, and assessing the damage. The second response is non-governmental. It was the aid, Red Cross and faith-based organizations and all sorts of volunteer groups moving in to set up aid stations. We didn't have utilities for some people a week. Our house in particular was 10 days to get running water. So water, food, shelter, blankets, clothing, all of this, that aid. And then, as things began to subside, connecting people, that NGO section is what helped connect people to the resources they needed to help put their lives back together. And that third wave is where private enterprise fits in. So it takes a partnership of all three levels. You have to have that. You cannot expect the private companies to be the first responders. It will not happen, folks. And so there is a definite role for government in our lives. We, Greensburg, Joplin, we've seen the damage that nature can wreak on the community. And we've chosen to live in a structured society. So there are definite appropriate roles for government in our lives, but we have people who don't believe it. It's all about personal responsibility. The government shouldn't be there to take care of people. The government should be just this little, I don't know what they think it should be. Actually.
How often have you heard the comment, we'll let the churches do it? Or how often have you heard the comment, well, those families ought to step forward and take care of their own? And, we hear that a lot. Actually, I heard that from a number of my fellow legislators when I was there. They would say, well, let the churches do it. That's a social thing. Let them do it. Why should the taxpayers pay that burden? Well, if you've been to talking with your churches lately about the tithing and whatnot that they need to have and the money that they need to have to try to fill in the blanks, it's very, very difficult. And you have very large churches and you have very small churches, and a lot of them are just drying up because they just don't keep getting people coming to them. There have been some articles written about the millennials not really going to church that much. You don't realize that those same people are the taxpayers, and they're going to put their money somewhere. But the private sector cannot do the same thing that government can.
The
Now,
private sector will not do the same thing that government can, because the private sector exists for a different reason. It's the profit motive, right? Businesses exist to profit. Government does not. So you can, this idea that we need to run government like a business, yeah, there are certain principles that would make things a little more efficient, but the government doesn't have the same mission. So it isn't an equal proposition, and the crossover is not appropriate.
let me throw this out as a question for you to think about, and we can talk about it a little bit later if you all want to answer it. You've heard a lot about people say, well, we need to live within our means. If you are the government, what is your means? It's the one area that doesn't really have a limit other than by a vote of the people or the representatives of the people as to what the need is.
Yeah, this is important, folks, because this is the excuse being given by the leadership that does not want to fix our problems. The excuse is we're limited by the resources available. We're going to have to make some hard choices because we just don't have the money. Well, guess what? We're not marooned on a desert island with one bottle of water to ration out all around. We have the power to make different choices and change the available resources. And we are choosing collectively not to do it.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Just recently,
recently they did some bonding to shore up capers. When you don't replace staff that is needed, but you're bonding, I believe that our government currently is spending more than they have before when you include all of that.
Sure.
And yet they've said they've reduced the overall. Instead, they've refocused those energies to do a payback, and those bond and interest payments truly are at a higher level right now because I think they're at about 4%.
4.92% for the $1 billion worth of papers bonds that were issued this summer.
And I know that with Shawnee Mission in the new bonding we just did, it was a 1.23 something. So they're not on a good speed or good standing.
No, the credit agencies have downgraded the state's credit rating, and that affects the cost of the bonds. Bonds aren't free. You know, it's like taking out a loan. There's interest to pay for the bonding. That's the key to how the executive branch has chosen to keep the state government afloat, folks. It's the dirty little secret. We have a constitutional amendment that says we will run a balanced state budget. We have borrowed, we're approaching $2.1 billion swept out of transportation funding since 2011 to our state general fund to pay the bills. Add $1 billion swept this year, or not swept, but restructured Capers debt, $1 billion bond that's not benefiting the Caper system. The savings in the restructuring, it was an arbitrage deal, the savings realized are not nearly as big as anticipated or hoped, but what little there is being put into the general fund. So we now have bond repayment obligations that are mandatory. That comes first when it comes to writing checks out of the state checkbook. And then we can fund state agencies. So we have started, no different than you or I opening up a MasterCard to pay our Visa bill while we're continuing to charge on American Express. So that's how this government is staying afloat.
And in the meantime, think about the projects that you see out here, the roads and building construction projects that are going on that also create jobs, but they are going on constantly. If, in fact, we continue on the path that we're going with regard to the transportation funding, you're going to see a lot of those either close down because they can't afford to keep them going, or you're going to see no new projects being promoted and being put out there in many parts of the state.
What you already are experiencing and may or may not know it is that when the fiscal year started on July 1, the Kansas Department of Transportation officially quit road maintenance projects. For this fiscal year and next, 16 and 17, that is where some of this money has come from. That is the hit in their budget. They cannot do routine maintenance on our roads. So what you will see is some minimal stuff done. So it's, when you see a pothole and there's a load of gravel shoveled in and some oil sprayed on it, and then the weight of the traffic kind of tamps it down, that's what's happening.
Does that mean we should carry a bag of asphalt in our car?
So there are already consequences to this. With yesterday's budget numbers, the total taken out of your transportation system this year, this fiscal year, is now at $459 million. That's the equivalent of the 0.4 of a cent sales tax that transportation receives. It's dedicated to transportation, and that money is being swept right back to the general fund.
Now this is under the umbrella of the executive branch. This is directly the responsibility
the governor's budget,
of the governor and his budget. It's supported by the people in the legislature that go along with it by that narrow margin that Melissa was talking about a while ago. And that, it makes a big difference in how many votes you have. If you have 63, you win. If you have 62, you don't. On the Senate side, just to give you an example how close things are, I as chair of Judiciary, I carried the bill when it went to the floor of the Senate. That was, the chairs do that over there more than on the House side. Anybody can carry them, but I carried them. And I had one that I needed to argue because my committee put it out there. And regardless of what your position is on this, it's an example. I argued to change the Kansas view or Kansas support for the death penalty. And I was carrying the bill that passed out of my committee that said we should abolish the death penalty in Kansas. The person I was arguing with was Derek Schmidt, who was at the time my vice chair of the committee, but also the majority leader in the Senate. We argued for 3.5 hours on the floor of the Senate that day, standing on our feet, arguing for 3.5 hours. At the end of the day, the vote was 20 to 20.
It takes 21 out of 40.
It takes 21 on the Senate side to pass that. It would have changed, at least on that side of the legislature. I don't think it would have passed if it had gone over to the House at that time. But nevertheless, that tells you just how close things can be in these debates. Now, if it's okay, I want to move on to the third branch of government, and then we can throw it open for some questions. I want to talk to you a little bit about the judicial branch. Now, I know you've got a big program coming up in the near future that's going to be addressing this in a lot more detail. But the third branch is the judicial branch. Now, I had this wonderful disc to play for you today, but unfortunately, my IT shortcomings don't allow me to do that. One of the things I do in my class out at college is I invite guest speakers to come into my class because they don't want to hear me talk for 3 hours for crying out loud. So I bring people in. Well, one day while I was sitting in the Senate, I got a call, and voice on the other end of the line said, Tim, I understand you have guest speakers to talk to your class out at Johnson County Community College. I said, well, yes, I do. He said, well, would you like for me to come and talk to your class? Well, it was one of those duh moments. It was the Chief Justice of the Kansas Supreme Court, Justice Davis, before he passed away. But he called and asked if he could come and talk to my class. You should have seen the look on the faces of the students when the Chief Justice walked in to talk to them about the judicial system. And he left a disc with me about his discussion. That was what I was going to show you. It's short. I'm talking about 10 minutes. But what you're left with is my interpretation of what the Chief Justice said. He went through the detail about how the courts are set up. One of the things that is happening now is there's a strong effort by the governor, and it's been going on since before I left, to change the way we select judges. Our court system is the 7 Supreme Court justices, and in order to change the way we select those judges, there has to be a constitutional change in the Kansas Constitution. That requires a vote by the legislature, and then, if it passes the legislature, it requires that the people vote on it in a vote in order to change that. The governor does not have the support of the general public if they know about it. And he knows that. But what happened is there's the second layer of the courts is the Court of Appeals. We now have 14 members of the Court of Appeals, and they sit in 3-judge panels around the state in various places to hear appeals. Their decision can be appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court then is the final word in terms of the state law. Well, the Court of Appeals judges do not have to be changed. That system does not have to be changed by the Constitution, because that's not in the Constitution. It's only the Supreme Court. So what happened in this latest legislation is the governor got enough votes, 63 and 21. He got enough votes to change the way that the Court of Appeals judges are selected. So that now, instead of having a committee that is a nominating committee like we've had for a long time, ever since 1953, I think it is, instead of that way, the governor can now appoint whoever he wants to the Court of Appeals with the approval of the Senate committee. Well, the way the Senate committee is structured now, I used to chair it, but now the way it's set up, it's a rubber stamp. Whoever the governor wants to appoint to that level is going to be appointed. Now, is it political? You bet it is. You're not going to see a lot of Democrats being appointed by the governor to that court. The other thing is, you're not going to see a lot of people that disagree with the governor being appointed to that level. Now, some of you have heard my story before, but I'm going to tell it again because I think it bears telling, and it is something that should be shocking to every Kansan if you think about it. I told you one of the reasons that I got unelected was because the Coke Industries and these other folks put out a lot of money because the governor was so angry with me because I would not go along with the way he wanted to change the way we select judges. And I was the chair of Judiciary in the Senate. The 4th time that I was in his office, I was here. Senator King was next to me. He's now the chair of the committee. And make no bones about it, carries the governor's water. Mr. Kinzinger, who was the chief of staff for the governor until he left and went to work for one of the financial people. He's still there. He's still behind the scenes. Mr. Stiegel, who is now Justice Stiegel. Landon Fulmer. And the governor. We're sitting around the coffee table in the governor's office. And the governor pointed his finger at me and he said, Tim, I do not understand why you can't go along with us and change the way we select judges so we can get judges who will vote the way we want them to. Think about how serious that is. Do we want an independent judiciary, a third branch of government that is there as a check and balance against the other two? Or is this more of a tyranny of the majority, which is really what the governor wants? And I don't care whether you're Republican, Democrat, or Independent. That is not something any of us should desire to have. That is not something that from the very beginning of our country we have fought against. But the governor wants to do that, to control the courts. They are so angry at the courts. And when did that start? It started with the school finance bill, way back in 2002. When the court made its ruling about school finance and said that the state was not adequately funding schools, it created a furor that is still going on today. And ever since then, there's been a movement to try to change the way that to get new judges so that we can have judges who vote differently on that issue as well as some other issues. But that's what they want to change.
Well, I would interject here. It is that. But this has also become an issue for the pro-life movement. So I have colleagues who have voted for every bill that has come up in front of us that further restricts and bans and changes women's access to reproductive health care. Every vote on those bills is what the pro-life movement would want it to be, and they have still been attacked during the campaign cycle because on the issue of an independent judiciary, they voted to protect our court system. So it has been adopted by another movement as well. It's all about being able to control who's sitting in judgment and controlling the outcome of our legal system, and that's chilling to contemplate.
Now, just to alert you to that, just as a follow-on to that, what's coming up is a critical vote that most people won't even have a clue about. How many times have you seen a list of judges on the ballot to retain them or not? Think about it. If you have people that vote no, now historically, I've been following this, and 60 to 80% on those retention votes vote to retain. The other 20 to 40 vote no all the time because they just don't want to vote for any judges. Most people don't know who these judges are unless they've had personal experience about going in front of one.
And really, isn't that a good thing? Like, should we know a whole lot about judges if we haven't had interaction? It really, to me, says they're not making headlines. They're doing their job. They're doing it well. They're not seeking press and attention.
But the other side of that is, we don't know. I used to get calls all the time. People would call me up and say, I don't know who these judges are. Is there anybody that I should vote against? And, well, okay, that was because I was city councilman and I was close to the people. They knew they could call and say, Tim, what do we do with this? That's that thing I was telling you about earlier. But the thing is, we've got 3 judges who are coming up for retention. We've got three judges who are coming up for retention.
On the Supreme Court.
On the Supreme Court. And five judges. And those 5 judges are going to be vulnerable if we do not turn out to vote and vote to retain them. If we do not retain them, there is a good chance that Governor Brownback will appoint 5 of our judges. And then you talk about changing the way that we have selected judges to the point that they then have judges who will vote the way he wants them to. Is that a critical vote? You bet it is. Is that something that people are going to really know about unless folks like the League of Women Voters and other organizations get out there and spread that word and say, do not vote to not retain these people?
Keep in mind, our election laws prevent the judges themselves from raising money to conduct a campaign. They can't do what the rest of us can do to protect our seats in a contested race. They cannot ask for money and campaign to retain their seat. But current law, Citizens United, allows all of those AstroTurf organizations, the dark money, to work against them. So if we don't work to educate voters and get the word out, the system itself is in great danger.
Well, those were I could tell you a lot more about the judicial system, but I think those are the points that we wanted to get across to you about the three branches of government and what's going on. But now, we'd like to hear your questions and hopefully respond to those and maybe address some other issues. Yes,
I'm going to ask you to please come up to the podium and ask your question up here so everybody can hear and see you. And if you want to make a line over here, that's perfect. While we're doing that, I do want to put out a word that Roberta Everledge is passing around a sign-up sheet for cookies for the judicial forum that's going to be held. So if you want to sign up to provide cookies or snacks, that would be great.
Can we sign up to get cookies?
Well, first of all, I want to thank both of you for the presentation you have made. And without the PowerPoint, you've done a great job. This is not just Kansas, folks. This is the way our federal government is run and other state governments run. The people that are in the majority have the power to appoint judges at the federal level, and they have control of the legislature, Congress of the United States, and the presidency of the United States. The same process goes on there. This is a battle, a philosophical battle, between those who believe individual freedom is everything and collective responsibility is minimal. So, unless you vote for higher taxes, this process is going to go on. And it's going to take a long time to change Citizens United. So, think about it when you go out and campaign for people, whether we're Republicans, Democrats, or Independents, because, as James Madison said, he worried about the factions in this country, and that means every little political splinter group and everything getting together and trying to function collectively. We need to find the proper level of government. And believe me, right now, the Republicans control 70% of the state legislatures. My question to these people, how are you going to go about changing this process for getting the word out? Because it's an important issue and it's going to have to start from the grassroots on up.
We're doing it. I make myself available to do talks to groups. I can't tell you, it's all over the state. It's not just here. I've spoken in Wichita, Manhattan, Topeka, Lawrence. I will go where I'm invited, and I will offer this kind of insight to help educate the people. But at the end of the day, it's the people who have to help me and my friends by turning out to vote. 18% of eligible voters turned out to vote in the August primaries last year. We can't change things with that level of turnout. The work this organization does to register voters, and yes, there are hurdles that are now in place that make that harder. It's still possible. You still need to do it. We need to get our kids, kids and grandkids, you've got to impress upon your own the importance of voting and participating in this great democracy. Of the people, by the people, for the people only works when the people participate. At the end of the day, I get one vote. I need 62 like-minded friends to help me move or block legislation on my side, and there need to be 21 on the Senate side. So it is a team effort. And having conversations one-on-one, my son's in the room, ask him. I am all politics all the time, because it doesn't matter if it's the sideline of a soccer game or the grocery store. When asked, I will engage. Just opportunities are endless to educate voters. I do coffees throughout the year in constituents' homes. I ask them to invite half a dozen people. We have a informal conversation. We get to know each other so that when the campaign cycle hits, I'm more than a name on a postcard. But it's a collective effort that we need to undertake. There is no magic way we're going to solve this. It's going to be an enormous battle, make no mistake. So it takes boots on the ground, people knocking doors to help us campaign. Yes, it takes money, it takes resources, manpower, it takes all of us pulling in the same direction.
It also takes people voting in the primaries, because what we've been relegated to in this country, across the board, across this country, not just in Kansas, we've been relegated to very few people really voting percentage-wise in the primaries. And what happens then is you have those people in the primaries being voted in by probably extremists on both ends. And when you get to the general election, who do you have to choose from? If we want to get it back to the middle, if we want to get it back to what we call responsible government and reasonable people who will be willing to talk to each other even though you may disagree on some issues, if we want to get it back to that, we have to get people to vote in the primary to put those people in and let them run against each other in the general if you have differences of opinion between Democrats and Republicans or independents. But we've got to do that, because if we don't do that, we will not change the system. We'll just have choices, too bad choices.
The coalition, the 58 of us that typically vote on these major issues, that's a collective bipartisan effort. There are 28 Democrats in the House. So that's 30 Republicans working with Democrats to try and do the right thing. My big transgression on the Education Committee was putting together a bipartisan coalition. There were 10 of us, 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans, who worked together to block some of the very harmful reform efforts. The Speaker did not like the work I did and removed me from that committee.
Our next question.
I don't know how good this question is, but I wonder, why is it that I couldn't just set up a dummy corporation and had everybody here give me money and use it to affect this election? How come I can't incorporate and be just as, my speech be just as free from a group as a corporation?
Roberta, there's nothing stopping you from doing that.
So let's do that. Let's do exactly that.
You don't have to invent that. I think it's Kansans for Fair Courts exists.
Well, we need to publicize. We need to do something.
Come see me, I know about that group.
Okay, my question is kind of like a plan, like they paid me to do it, and also I have not received any money yet. I'm hoping that I will.
Did you get a pen?
But nonetheless, the question that I have is that I have been, and many friends have been persons until the league began their educational work. I'll make an announcement for the league. With educating us about the courts. But I'm going to ask a question that I know the answer to. Why in the world would I vote to retain some judges that I do not know? What are the safeguards that have been put in place that I can be assured that I should be voting for retention?
I think that's a great question. I really do. Actually, I didn't pay for that question. We have a system that is made up of people that are appointed or elected to be on these panels of selection of judges, and it's called the merit selection process. Instead of just political appointees, there's a merit selection where you go, if you want to be a judge, you go in front of this commission, and you go through a lot of scrutiny. And once they get finished with their questioning, and it's open to the public, by the way, contrary to some of the comments that people have made, but once you go through that scrutiny, they select 3 people to be sent to the governor for the governor to appoint one of them. Now, the governor's complaints fall short for me because on the Judicial Selection Committee at the state level, the governor has 4 of those appointees.
Of 9.
Out of 9. He's got plenty of say, and then gets to appoint one of the three. But once they've gone through that kind of scrutiny and that kind of questioning, the public can have a pretty confident feeling that that's an okay person for the most part to be the judge. I'm not so sure if it's somebody who's appointed behind closed doors for political reasons by the judge. Now, maybe they're good and maybe they're not. I've heard some good things. I've heard good things about this thing. I've heard good things about Justice Spiegel making some good decisions on the court. I didn't like how he got there, but I'm glad to hear he's making good decisions because that's what we need. But on the other hand, if we have people who are appointed and don't really meet those tests, I don't think the people can feel as comfortable and confident in who we've got on the bench. But with these committees, I think that's the best way, and it's merit selection. It isn't political selection.
Well, and that's one key piece. But I think there are also ways you can do a little bit of it, and it takes some effort, but you can do some research. There are avenues, and I didn't come prepared to share websites today, but there are organizations that will offer review of the judges up for selection, and I would be willing to bet that in the next cycle with the scrutiny on the Supreme Court retention races, Mainstream Coalition probably will have something to say about the judicial retention questions. So you can do the same kind of background research on judges that you can for any other candidate, and I hope you all do, and I hope you encourage your friends.
I hate to sound. I don't want to be negative because I agree with what was said. But you have to be careful about the group that's putting out the word. Now, mainstream, yeah, but you get to some of these groups. Americans for Prosperity put out a decision as to who should be a good judge and who shouldn't be. I'm not going to believe that for a minute. And most people shouldn't, but there are people that support Americans for Prosperity, and they get their paycheck from the coke industries and that sort of stuff. So
I'm going to trust that by next summer, this organization would be able to point you to credible resources, and that you can use them for yourself and share them with others, so that we can cut through all of that noise and get to the right resources. That's a good mission for the League of Women Voters.
First, I would like to thank again, listen to him. I mean, you've done a superb job. Closer to my mouth.
Okay, is this better? Okay. My question is what you would think of the merits and the possibility and the prospects of this idea. We spoke earlier about the problem with if you sponsor a bill, you put your name on it as a sponsor, and it's a gut and go, then what if we simply have a bill where if there is a gut and go, the original sponsor's name drops off, if it's done by 100%, because I think there's several conservatives who don't like this too.
I would be very supportive. I think that is just complete and total common sense, because if you can change every other element of the bill, why wouldn't you change the sponsorship? And I think that's excellent.
I've been advocating for that for about 14 years. It is scary when you put your name on a bill and then they change everything in the bill and you're still a sponsor. I mean, that's pretty grim.
Well, I have a couple of questions. First, the Attorney General and the Secretary of State are both elected statewide. Recently, in response to a league-sponsored event, the criticism was raised with regard to proof of citizenship and the 90-day rules regarding who are you really affecting. And there was a comment out of the governor's office by a staff member, and the governor defended it. So my question is, where do the statewide elected Secretary of State and AG fit into this three layers that constitute the government?
They're executive branch.
Okay, so they are executive. So it's not all government-appointed executive heads. And then the second question deals with privatization. One of the ways of cutting government is through privatization. And certainly Medicaid in the state was privatized to CanCare, and then the corrections partially privatized. And so what do you predict will be the outcome with regard to prisons, since that's next on the list for big expense that could be cut?
Well, I always say I don't have a crystal ball, and I can't predict, and that is to some extent because it's very hard to take the temperature of the Republican majority in the House. There are 97 of us, and there are at least 5 very distinct factions within that supermajority. So on any given issue, there's not a predictable pattern. But I would expect to see some pretty ferocious pushback to that notion. There's an idea floating of selling the Turnpike Authority, which is a very high-functioning, very efficient branch of government. They manage themselves beautifully, but in order to raise revenue, rather than raising any kind of taxes, we would sell that agency off to the private sector, which would be a disaster. I don't think that we should privatize any. I think corrections properly should be a state function. My work was to block the privatization of our public school system on the Education Committee. So I am not a believer that that's the way that the state should do business, and I expect that would be a fierce battle, much like any of these other privatization ideas have been to date.
When you get to the corrections department and you think about the people that they're dealing with, I've visited a private prison in Oklahoma, and I can tell you that that's not the way that we should go. And it's a profit motive, profit oriented. They are a business. They're in the business of taking care of prisoners. And so when you start to think about how you're going to deal with the whole issue of corrections improvements and that sort of thing, they're not going to be in favor of turning people loose.
Yeah.
What I think is more likely to occur, and it's an interesting alliance at the national level that's pushing for change. It's revising the criminal code so that nonviolent offenders don't spend as much time in our prisons. Certain offenses wouldn't come with any prison time. It would be fines and treatment, certainly for drug offenses and things like that, and treatment programs and other types of the consequence for the crime committed. Coke Industries and the ACLU are working together to reform the sentencing code. So I think that begins to buy enough political cover that some folks who don't want to be seen as soft on crime and all of those election year tactics could feel safe voting for some reform. So we're not sending as many people to prison for as long, and we free up bed space that way. I think that's a much more realistic road that we'll travel down.
Have any of you toured the prisons? I went up to Lansing the last time I toured one, and one of the things that was kind of shocking to me was on the first floor of Building 1, I walked down the row and walked by the cells of the individuals who were there. All of them were in very, very poor health, and many of them were on IV. It was like a nursing home wing where the people go that is kind of the end. Walking down an entire row, and those people are no threat to anybody, and yet we're taking care of them constantly. And if you look at those kind of costs within the prison system, that's kind of a rude awakening.
Well, the prisons are a warehouse for the mentally ill today because we don't have enough room in our mental health system. We've closed hospitals and we have a reduced capacity in that system, and we're not putting the funding towards it. So those folks end up oftentimes in our prisons, and there are much more beneficial ways of dealing with the problems there.
And the county jails.
We'll take one more question from this gentleman here.
I was going to say, about 20 years ago, I spent about 2 years in Leavenworth. I spent about 2 years in Leavenworth Penitentiary, not the guest, but I read the paper in your comment. These corrections officers are making about $28,000 a year. There'd be no way I would ever think of taking a job in that place for what they have to go through. But I've observed.
I want to take this opportunity to ask each one of you to put your hands together and let's give a great big thank you to our speakers. I know that we've done forums with a panel, and this is a little bit different change. I like to change it up every once in a while, so we have a little different approach. Everyone in this room is very intelligent. Everyone in this room is devoted to getting people out to vote. How many of you learned something new today? All right, that's what we want to do. We want to educate to help everybody in this group understand the importance of what the League of Women Voters does. I'm now going to turn this over to our co-president, Ann Norberry, and I'm going to move our speakers back to the table so they can answer questions.